Let's go to my next guests on the program, Greg Brown, political reporter at The Australian, Tom McElroy at The Australian Financial Review. Thanks both for your time.
G'day, Tom.
You brought in a dog-eared copy of Anthony Albanese's
Got the speech right in front of me.
I saw you had copy all over the newspaper today. You're right across this. What's your hot take out of this review process?
Well, I think this is a way, you know, it's been a really difficult 6 months for Labor, obviously after that devastating election loss. And this provides Anthony Albanese with an opportunity for him to put his own mark on the party. It gives him a clear path forward. And I think his speech today was a very good start. He talked about wanting to change the policies, the substance of the policies, not just, you know, things around the periphery and the way they talk about things.
And not just, the implication was, oh, we're not just going to ditch these three and keep these seven or something. It's really rethinking everything. It's
rethinking everything, and also some of the cultural aspects as well. That he acknowledged that the party's standing with people. You know, when we've seen what's gone on with New South Wales Labor and John Secker, it is difficult to get you to trust
unions as well.
It's difficult to say to the public, "Oh, we've got all this big agenda, but don't worry, trust us." When this has been going on, and he has addressed that. But the other thing I really liked about the speech was he talked about the Labor Party for the 21st century, which includes small business. I mean, what was Labor's strategy for small business at the last election? And it wasn't much really. And in Western Sydney, Michelle Rowland has spoken about this. In Western Sydney, there's a lot of entrepreneurial migrants who Labor need to be have more of a vision for these people.
It's a good point, actually. I'm going to mention that. She's on the program this hour.
Oh, she
making
is?
notes as we go.
Well, that's good.
Your take on all of this? I mean, the good thing about Anthony Albanese is this review was pretty broad. It said there were issues to some degree with just about everything. So he's got the sort of authority now to be able to say, I'm redoing things and this is why.
It seems extremely thorough. They've gone at a forensic level through all of the failures in what should have been a thumping victory for Bill Shorten. As one Labor person said to me this morning, if the party's still talking about this report and Anthony Albanese's speech on Monday, there might be some problems. But I agree with Greg's comments a moment ago that there's an opportunity for him to start afresh, to put his stamp and his authority on not only policies but day-to-day management of the parliamentary party. It's a long road back, but now they can put the Shorten era and this shock loss behind them, I think.
Yeah, and he's definitely flagged. One thing he hasn't, he has told everyone though very clearly that, hey, don't expect policies. Like, policies will be in the lead up to the election.
Well, that was interesting. So he said there's values coming up until the May budget.
Yeah.
From the May budget, then we'll establish our policy platform. So presumably from May onwards, that's the beginning in some way of policy formation. They've got the December conference next year, 2020. So that comes a lot earlier in the election cycle this time around.
Yeah, I think they won't start landing on things really until 2021. However, I think clearly franking credits is gone. I think that he made a very strong indication of that today, that it was just too hard to sell from opposition. When you had pensioners, he said pensioners were coming up to him saying, could you be doing this to me? And he said, well, you're a pensioner, so you're exempt. Have you ever owned a share? No, but they still thought they were going to be captured by it.
They knew they had that problem before the election. It was amazingly complicated to get through with that message.
Franked dividends, and everyone went, what's that?
And it wasn't enough for Bill Shorten to say, if you don't know what a franking credit is, this doesn't apply to you. Or if you're a pensioner, this doesn't apply to you. It didn't work.
There was also the fact they let the pensioner guarantee, as they called it, didn't come until a few days after announcing the policy.
Right. That's right. And my 96-year-old nana, who's never owned a share in her life, actually called me and thought she was captured with it, and she was very upset about it. And said, Nana, have you ever owned a share? No. Well, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But yeah, so it was definitely one of those things that once people heard on the first day that pensioners could be in with this, and then that
well, because you tune into the policy on day one, and people don't watch each iteration so closely, right? The day one is a lot of the time when that sinks through, and then they sort of tune out again until later on. So that was the slip up there.
I remember we did a story the day after it was announced. Our story was, Bill Shorten will consider exempting pensioners if this all becomes too difficult. And he denied that the next day. He said, no, we're not going to do that. So, I mean...
It was the way they carved it out, it was such a small amount of the overall revenue. It was a real head-scratcher. Look, what was interesting as well is the report didn't single out a particular policy, but it did say the issue was they were saddled with all of these spending policies and then needed the tax to match it. Now, if they're going to be talking about the economy and jobs, isn't that the wrong way to do it? Don't you figure out your tax policies that Labor sees as fair and necessary but also help the economy, then you match your spending to it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think hindsight is 20/20. When you look back at these things, there's always better ways of approaching policy. I think the problem is they've been thoroughly repudiated. So now, if Anthony Albanese is going to take until perhaps a year or 6 months before the next election, that's a huge opportunity for the government to whack Labor. And we see that in Parliament all the time. Scott Morrison trying to act like Labor's in government. Attacks along the lines of Wayne Swan and Sir Tax-a-Lot and all that stuff.
So, yeah, well, does that speak to... You don't think there'll be policy until 2021, but they'll need to knock some things on the head before then?
Well, I think clearly franking credits, he's just about...
but that
I'm verbling him a bit, but he has very clearly said that franking credits was too difficult to sell from opposition. So I think there'll be a couple of totemic things that will go earlier. Yeah. I think it was very...
And formally go, not just indicated. They'll go, this is out.
Yeah, I think that, that's right. I think, interestingly, he said today that Labor will always spend more on health than the coalition, so...
Always more on health and education, but the caveat was if you're going to raise less in tax, you're going to spend less on it. So again, I guess that goes back to what I was saying before. We're going to have a budget now, our own little budget, and stick to it.
I thought that health and education comment was more symbolic rather than directly linked to dollars. It'd be interesting to see what tweaks or major change negative gearing has before the next election. That's good money for Labor, and a lot of people would expect good policy.
But what I found really interesting about the review and what it had to say about franking credits and negative gearing is that it wasn't too scathing of those policies because it recognised that these policies were needed to fund the spending. I think the problem was there was just too much out there. So therefore, revenue measures were needed. Therefore, it's understandable that these were there. I found fascinating that the bigger problem was too much spending.
Well, and negative gearing, remember, is this policy, rightly or wrongly, that people feel strongly about, particularly when the house market's soaring now. It's starting to take off again. In 2016, when Labor still had this policy, it didn't hurt them at all, really. The only attack line the government rolled out beforehand was, what was it, the one-year-old with an investment property that wouldn't have one otherwise, just before the election. So it can still be fertile ground, possibly, for Labor.
And as people have pointed out, the defeat in 2019 is linked to some of the relative success that they had in 2016 through policies like that weren't hotly contested until Josh Frydenberg stood up in January and started making...
Maybe not stress tested properly then.
Yeah, perhaps.